Okay, welcome everyone to another Research in Focus interview here in the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland. My name is Matt McDonald and I'm joined today by one of my newest colleagues, Professor Chris Reus-Smit, who joined the school late last year after spending some time before that at ANU and the EUI in Florence. And we're talking today about his new book, Individual Rights and the Making of the International System, out now from all good booksellers.
And some bad ones.
And some bad ones. Chris, how did you come to write the book?
Right, it's a book that's been with me for about 10 years actually. I've been working on this on and off. And the two impulses were first of all a frustration with the way in which the story of human rights in world politics is generally told. So it's really the story that we get, and it's often at the beginning of textbooks, or chapters on human rights, that really human rights become important in world politics somewhere in the 20th century. Usually the story is after 1945, with a few antecedents like anti-slavery and so forth. But it's really a 20th century story, and it's really a story about how after the Second World War you get the development of the international human rights regime, and most of the debate then revolves around the degree to which the norms of the international human rights regime shape more or less effectively the way in which states conduct themselves internally and externally. And that frustrated me because it seemed to miss something about the history of rights in world politics that I think is evident in the almost complete neglect, for example, of the French and the American revolutions, which I think in any way that you tell those stories, the rights of individuals were important parts of those stories. And so either you end up in a situation where you don't think that things like that had anything to do with world politics, or if you do think they had something to do with world politics, then that changes the story we have about individual rights. And I think it was partly out of that impulse, and also partly out of my sort of long-term interest in trying to understand the origins and development of the modern international system. And so the book is about individual rights in world politics, but it's also an account of how the modern international system evolved through the lens of individual rights.
Because you make the case that most analyses of human rights really in the international system start with the question of how that state system, how human rights might be realised within an existing state system, but you start from a different point. Right.
So my starting point is really to ask, in a sense, it's that sort of classic historical sociologist's question of how did the system of sovereign states come to be itself? And of course, the thing that I find really interesting about that question is it comes out of the uniqueness of the world that we live in today. Most of us international relations scholars are really used to talking about the kind of eternal rhythms and verities of international politics. But in fact, a world in which almost the entire surface of the globe is divided up into territorial sovereign states, so that you have a universal state system, is a really very recent development. It's in its final phase of development, is a product really of the last 50 years with the decolonisation of the great European empires. And so what interested me this time, and I've told the story of the international system in a number of different ways, but this time what interested me was the question of the globalisation of this system of sovereign states. How did it come from its origins in early modern Europe to encompass the globe, always through processes of imperial fragmentation into successor sovereign states. And that's really what the book is about, and it highlights the role that individual rights play in that process of the development of the system of sovereign states itself. So in a sense, the kind of radical punchline of the book is that individual rights, and I talk about individual rights, not human rights predominantly, and I have reasons for that, but individual rights are not just kind of marginalia to world politics, but were in fact very important in the development of the system of sovereign states itself.
You mentioned some of your other work. A lot of people would be familiar with the moral purpose of the state. Here there's an even more expansive historical sweep there, but there you focus on different international societies, and here on a sort of global account of the state system. How would you define the relationship between those two projects?
Yeah. And that's a really good question, and it's a question that about halfway through writing this book, I thought, oh shit, I better have an answer for how these two books connect with each other, because moral purpose, as you say, is really asking the question, how do we understand the development of the sort of most basic institutions of international systems, and it looks at that through an analysis of 4 different international societies, and the ancient Greek, the Renaissance Italian, absolutist European, and then the modern from the middle of the 19th century onward. And in a sense, what I was trying to do in that book was to say, IR scholars usually look at those cases and they say, look, system of sovereign states, like politics, right? And what's really interesting about those cases is that in each of those situations, different kinds of basic institutional practices emerged to deal with many of the same kinds of functional problems. So that raises the question of, well, what is it that's driving the development of fundamental institutions? And that book was about an attempt to explain that. Now this book, so actually the way I explain the relationship in this book is to say, is to invoke the language that's often applied to the European Union of institutional deepening and institutional broadening. So institutional deepening is about the kind of the building of the architecture of institutions within Europe, okay, and their ever increasing density and complexity. And institutional broadening is about expanding the European Union to include other states. And I think in a way these two books are a little bit like that. So the first book is really about the institutional architectures of these international societies. And the second book, the new book, is really about how that society of states, although I actually have a reason for talking about an international system in this case, gradually expands to encompass more and more states, and also geographically over time. So that's how I see the relationship. They're different kind of cuts on the institutional. It
does feel like you're building to something though. Is this part of a trilogy? Is that the next step?
Look, I think it was, to the extent that this book relates to the earlier book, it was as much by accident as anything. So if there's a third book, it'll be by accident.
Okay. Yeah. You talk. One final question before I let you go. In this book and in Moral Purpose, there's a massive historical sweep, really. Can you talk us through some of the challenges of a macro-historical analysis of the evolution of the state system? Would you issue a health warning to researchers who are interested in this type of big picture?
Well, I think it might be a little bit like the health warning that goes on the side of bottles of alcohol, right? that you've got to be careful about this, but it can be really nice and exciting. So look, I think I was as an undergraduate, I was a politics and history double major, and so history's always been something that's been a great interest to me. And what I found through it's interesting because it wasn't until my doctoral studies that I actually kind of rediscovered history as part of something that you could use to study IR. I tended to have my history studies there and my IR studies there, and it was only in my PhD that they sort of came together. But I think one of the things for me about working with history has been that IR scholars have traditionally kind of used and abused history. I think it's a field that, and this is a story that's been told many times, but it's a field that treated history very much as a kind of grab bag of facts that you pull on in order to justify your particular theoretical position, basically. And so what I think is very exciting about re-engaging with history is that it provides really just an extraordinary resource for rethinking some of our most basic assumptions, theoretical assumptions as well as empirical assumptions. So I think there's still an enormous amount of work to be done there. And of course, one of the things that drew me into it was I did my PhD right at the end of the Cold War, And at that time, all of a sudden you had a flip in the field from saying what we're really understanding is about continuity to saying, oh, hang on, how do we understand change? And of course, as soon as you say, how do we understand change, then that draws you into history. I think you can't, there's no way you can avoid it then. And that's how I, in a sense, came to study history. But of course, the kind of work that I do here, which I describe as macro historical work, it's often comparative historical work, it's often taking, as in the new book, it's taking particular cases and moments in history and using those as ways of understanding development over time. And of course there are all sorts of methodological issues that are associated with the kind of the advantages and disadvantages, the pitfalls of doing that kind of work. One, I think obviously one dance that somebody like myself is always involved in is you're working with these historical cases and historical periods that you're not an expert on. So, for example, my favourite chapter in the book is in fact the chapter on the collapse of the Spanish Empire, which I'd never worked on before, and so I loved doing the research for that. But of course, I'm not a specialist on the collapse of the Spanish Empire, and of course there are many people who are specialists on it. And so there's an element of how do you think about the work that you do of a macro historical nature when you're not a specialist in that area. And I think some people might say, well, there's something fundamentally illegitimate about doing that. But I think my take has always been this. First of all, people like myself who do macro historical work are asking questions that are different from the questions that the specialists on those areas are asking. And the only way that you can get at these questions is by taking a much larger historical canvas than the specialist would be comfortable with. And of course making generalisations and observations about comparing different historical periods that specialists may not be comfortable with. But the justification, I think, is that this is a way of getting a purchase on particular questions that specialists are not asking. So, for example, the globalisation of the modern international system. So I think the questions part of it makes it a compelling project. But also I think there are certain responsibilities that come with doing this kind of work. And one of the things that a lot of my doctoral students have a historical dimension to their work. Surprise, surprise. But one of the things that I always counsel them is I say, look, one of the obligations that you have is to become very, very familiar with the historiography surrounding the period that you're working on. You really have to know what historians are saying about this period. You have to know what the debates are, and even if you're taking a position within those debates, which invariably you are, you need to have good reasons for taking those positions. So, the place that you don't want to find yourself is the place where you're just out of step totally with the historical record. I mean, most of us are just not confident, for example, in doing what Martin Bernal did in his famous book on Black Athena, which is just stepping in as a Chinese historian into the history of the Near East and saying, well, that was all wrong, and actually the roots of European civilization come from North Africa. And of course that takes an extraordinary ability, but to try and overturn an entire literature. I think for those of us that are doing the macro historical work, we have to just be very careful to really show to the historians, well, I know the debates in this field, I know that literature, and this is why I've taken this particular line. And then the worst that can happen is people can disagree with the line that you've taken, but you're not sitting out there on your own. So I think there are kind of I think little safety things that you can make sure that you strap on and observe safety rules that mean that the health warning might not be necessary. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I for one am glad I'm glad you do this type of research, and we're very lucky to have you here in the school. The book that we've been talking about is Individual Rights and the Making of the International System, out now with Cambridge University Press. And Chris, thanks very much for joining us.
Great, thanks, Matt.
We'll see you next time.